So at puberty again, follicular stimulating hormone stimulates the ovarian cycle for completion, and that's when the primordial follicles will develop into primary follicles, secondary follicles, and etc. So the primordial follicle, again, it has a primary oocyte, and it's surrounded by a single layer of squamous follicular cells, so they are fairly small. And that primary oocyte within the primary follicle is in arrested development, or stops developing, when the human female fetus is between 3 to 7 months old, and the arrest happens in meiosis I, the first meiotic cell division. Then at puberty, when the follicular development commences and the ovarian cycle commences to completion, the primordial follicle develops into a primary follicle. And this has still a primary oocyte, and it's surrounded by a few layers of now cuboidal follicular cells, which are also called granulosal cells. Granulosa cells, which will provide nutrients for the developing oocyte. So the granulosa and what are called fecal endocrine cells will produce estrogens like estradiol, which are produced again by the follicles. So they provide, or they initiate bone and muscle growth, secondary sexual characteristics of the human female. So this is occurring at once puberty sets in, sex-related behaviors and drive, and then maintaining the normal functioning of the sexual organs of the female during her reproductive years. So from a primary follicle, we get the next developmental stage, a secondary follicle, and here we still have a primary oocyte, but now multiple layers of granulosa cells within the follicle. And then the next step is a tertiary follicle, also called a Graafian follicle. Now the oocyte has developed to a secondary oocyte, and now there's many layers of granulosal cells and the characteristic appearance of a liquid-filled antrum, as we see here. Now, interestingly, the oocyte is arrested in development at meiosis II, and it will stay arrested up until the point that fertilization is completed, or when fertilization is complete. When fertilization occurs, meiosis II is completed only at that stage. So then at fertilization, the primary oocyte is fertilized by a sperm cell. Meiosis II is completed by the oocyte. The genetic information from the oocyte egg and sperm fuse. You get a fertilized egg called the zygote. And here's just a picture of a large Graafian follicle or tertiary follicle. There's the secondary oocyte and many granulosal cells and a large antrum. And the entire thing, again, tertiary follicle or Graafian follicle. So at ovulation, the tertiary follicle or Graafian follicle ruptures, releasing the secondary oocyte, which normally would enter into the uterine tube. The remnants of the tertiary follicle, where's my cursor? Here we go. The remnants of the tertiary follicle are retained within the ovary, and it becomes what's called the corpus luteum, meaning yellow body. It's somewhat yellowish, I guess. So that's the corpus luteum, and it has an important function in producing progesterone and estrogen, which are going to, as we'll see, retain or maintain the uterine lining in the uterus, because if this oocyte, where's my cursor? Sorry guys. Because if the oocyte gets fertilized, it'll take 7 to up to 10 days for it to reach the uterus and implant in the uterine wall. So in the meantime, the female has to not go into the menstrual bleeding or menses, and what prevents that is progesterone and estrogen that are secreted by the corpus luteum for up to 12 to 14 days after ovulation. After 12 to 14 days, the corpus luteum degrades into what's called the corpus albicans. If no fertilization is to occur, the production of progesterone and estrogen drops. Again, if no fertilization occurs, and then the female goes into the menstrual bleeding or menses, where the lining of the uterus is shed or lost. Here's a picture of the ovary model that you'll see in the lab component, with primordial follicles, secondary follicles here. Notice the multiple layers of cells. Primary follicle there. Here's a large tertiary or Graafian follicle that's just undergoing ovulation. There's a secondary oocyte about to be ejected. Notice the yellowish color. There's the corpus luteum, and then the remnant corpus albicans. So after ovulation, the ovulated oocyte, secondary oocyte, would then normally naturally enter into the uterine tube, fallopian tube, on its way towards the uterus. The uterine tube is about 5 inches long. It's a muscular tube, has ciliated columnar epithelium, mucosal lining, that the movement of the cilia help bring in the oocyte and help push it along towards the uterus. The oval regions, the fimbriae are the finger-like extensions of the infundibulum, the first part of the uterine tube, and then the ampulla is the middle part, and then lastly the isthmus connects to the uterine part, which leads into the uterus. And muscular contractions of the muscularis layer of the uterine tube and the cilia help push the oocyte towards the uterus. Okay, so then the uterus, kind of a pear-shaped muscular organ, smooth musculature, and usually tilted somewhere forward over the bladder in what's referred to as anteflexion position. It nourishes via the placenta and carries and protects the fetus if a pregnancy is to occur. This is a cross-section here of the uterus showing the uterine cavity or lumen. And then at labor, the smooth musculature of the uterine wall will contract and will propel and expel the fetus out of the cervix, in through the vagina, out the vagina, which is now serving as the birth canal. So the uterus is kind of held in place by suspensory ligaments. There's a broad ligament seen here. The uterosacral ligament, which goes posteriorly towards the sacrum. Then there's the round ligament seen here, which goes anteriorly towards the mons pubis. And then the cardinal ligaments all work to stabilize the uterus and hold it in place. And the cardinal ligament is not really shown here at all on this diagram. The overall anatomy or regions of the uterus. The fundus is this domed superior portion. The body is the bulk of the uterus. Fairly thick with smooth muscle in what's called the myometrium. Then the isthmus is where it narrows, leading to the cervix, which has what's called an internal os and external os, and the cervical canal, which extends the cervix with the external os extending into the vagina. So the uterine wall in cross-section has 3 layers. The perimetrium is the external serosa layer of the uterus. The thick muscular layer is the myometrium, which contracts during labor to expel the fetus. And then innermost is the endometrium. Mucosal lining of the uterus has a lamina propria with abundant uterine glands. As you see here, the endometrial layer gets elaborated or gets enlarged during a cycle of the uterine cycle, which is the functionalis or functional layer, and that's what's shed or lost during menstrual bleeding or menses. And the basalis or basal layer of the endometrium is always retained. Okay, so the functional layer or the stratum functionalis, that's what's shed during menstruation, and then the basal layer is always retained. And the basal layer will regenerate the functional layer during the ovarian cycle or the uterine cycle or the menstrual cycle, which has 3 phases. The menstrual phase occurring during days 0 through 7 of the full uterine cycle. During this phase, shedding of the functional layer occurs if no pregnancy has occurred, and that's referred to as menstruation or menses. The basal layer is always retained of the endometrium, and the reason the functional layer is lost during menstruation is due to a decrease in progesterone and estrogen levels within the female. Notice here progesterone in black, the black line, and estrogen in red, they're fairly low. You notice at other times during the menstrual or uterine cycle, those levels are much higher. And also because the corpus luteum is degraded and becomes the corpus albicans, and its amount of estrogens and progesterones that it secretes have dropped because the corpus luteum has degraded. Again, if no pregnancy has occurred. At that point, during the shedding of the endometrial layer, follicular stimulating hormone, which is relatively high in concentration from the developing follicles, stimulates follicular development, so that at day 14 of the cycle, a mature tertiary follicle will ovulate. So during the proliferative phase, days 7 to 14 roughly, there's the restoration of the functional layer. It starts to regenerate, and that's due to an increase in estrogen levels secreted by the developing follicles. And with an increase in spike, where's my cursor here, in luteinizing hormone and follicular stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary right about day 14, that results in a ovulation or rupture of one of the mature follicles with the ejection of the secondary oocyte right about day 14. Then the secretory phase is next from about day 14 to 28. And at this point, the uterine glands enlarge, the amount of secretion increases, and the endometrial arteries and the endometrial's functional layer enlarge, because if this oocyte gets fertilized due to sexual